Hi folks, I am Alan Watt and this is Cutting Through the Matrix. And they're always programming you. As I say, if you look into, start with the Vienna group, and the Vienna Circle was also a musical group that were doing experimental music from the late 1800s into the early 1900s. Then they combined with the philosophical groups, and then they also created the movements, the Frankfurt group, that decided to use art, music, and psychology and philosophy mixed together with the precision of wording, precision of mind control wording from the actual Vienna group itself running the lyrics. That hasn't changed today. And also with incredible use of symbology. The incredible use of symbology as a language, a definite mental language, which we all subconsciously understand. It programs them as subconsciously, and it doesn't come into our consciousness that we've even been programmed. But there's stacks of stuff out there on these particular groups, and they were brought into the US in the 1930s and given presidential rights through the Macy Group to form and take over and create the American culture of the future. A lot of them belong to the OSS. They then transformed into the CIA, still working with the same groups. And that's why they published that book too, that only goes up to 1967, about America's, how the CIA controlled America's culture during the Cold War. It was all these groups that gave your culture. They brought in the drugs with the permission of the government and the big pharma companies that made those drugs, the LSD and so on. And they also were given millions and millions of dollars to train specific people to be the first stars. Their job was to make them stars with unlimited funding. People who could never make a dime on the street with a guitar and a hat were to be made stars. But as long as they followed the orders and sang about the things and brought in the sex and the free love and all this stuff into it, the stuff was all written for them. Theo Adorno was a big player with the Frankfurt group.
And his work with the Beatles there.
He owned the rights of all the Beatles songs, and when he died, it went up for auction, and Michael Jackson competed with Paul McCartney for the titles. And there's Bob in California. Are you there, Bob?
Hey, Alan, how's it going?
Not too bad.
I read a book the other day that floored me. And there's very few people, as you know, that you can communicate once you get to this level of information and understanding. And so it's pretty much me and one other guy. So I thought I'd ask you what you thought of this book. And it's called The Protocols. Are you familiar with the book I'm talking about?
Yeah.
I was wondering what your impression of that was, because it pretty much ties up everything, that we're talking about.
Mm-hmm. There's no doubt that whoever wrote it, there's no doubt whatsoever, they knew the agenda for a whole 100 years or more.
Right.
And they talked about things which hadn't happened at that time. They even talked about how they would make sports a prime occupation for men, for basically watching, not participating, but watching. All of these kind of things, which really would have sounded crazy back in the early 1900s, when no city and across Europe had a sports arena, for instance. So they talked about arenas getting put across the world, how music would be used incredibly to alter people's opinion, how they would create massive sexual promiscuity. All of that was in there. There's no doubt about it. But you got to understand too that those things that were into that book were discussed commonly in the universities of that time, especially in Germany and in academia and philosophy. They were already talking about how to control the mass man and how to destroy. Remember, it all came from Marxism too, because Marxism had all the 10 planks down there, and there's actually more than 10, but they've accomplished every one of them, right down to the present where they're redistributing your wealth. They've already destroyed the family unit. They've already created the government agencies that would take over from the family unit and social work departments and experts. But you're right, whoever wrote that darn thing knew the whole agenda, absolutely.
Yeah. So later on, I guess the Frankfurt School had a similar thing with Marxism, and
The
all
Frankfurt
of their
School,
goals.
definitely. That came out of Frankfurt. It carried on. It also joined with the Macy Group. The British aristocracy got involved with them, like Bertrand Russell was a member of them, of the Macy Group. They also worked, some of their members, including Arthur Kessler, worked for MI5, by the way, during World War II. That's been declassified now, along with Bertrand Russell. They actually worked together. But they worked with the Macy Group. They were sent over to the U.S. to create the culture for America, working eventually with the CIA in post-war conditions to create the culture for America. And they've declassified all of that in a very good book called America's Cultural Cold War. Declassified stuff. It's a great book to read. All the characters involved are there, how they literally... it wasn't the Russians who went overboard with degrading stuff for people and sexuality. No, it was the U.S. being led by the Macy Group, who was put in charge of it by the President of the U.S., by the way. Getting back to political correctness and what you can say and what you cannot say. Now, you got to look into the Frankfurt School to understand who was behind it. The Frankfurt School was a university they set up in Germany. It's appeared, and people get very confused with this term communism, because it's been so misdiagnosed in so many places. It's got many fronts as well. Even the people who are ardent followers of it on the low levels have no idea of what it really, really is. But the Frankfurt School was set up. They ran out of Germany when Hitler came in, and they went to the United States and Britain. And these guys were specialists using psychology, which tells me again the depth of national and people's psychology that they understood. It was way beyond Freudian terms. This is very old science, obviously. But their job was to examine the cultures of each nation and simply adjust the perception of each nation to accept this same agenda of globalism, with an intellectual elite running the whole show and getting the public to accept it. And they would do that by looking at each culture and then taking over the culture industry within each nation. And this is all documented stuff if you look up Frankfurt School. And a slightly different one for the US. Britain, again, a slightly different one for them. And they ran the BBC, by the way. They still do. And at one time you couldn't get into the BBC for a job on any position unless you came from Eton. And in the 1960s, the Royal Institute of International Affairs and the Council on Foreign Relations from the States and all the other branches from Canada, Australia, New Zealand, India even, met in London. It was mainstream. And they were talking about bringing in a global culture in about 1964. And that's what the meeting was all about. And their big problem was, would they use Britain to spearhead the cultural change? Or would they use the United States and Hollywood and their massive programs? It took them 2 weeks to decide that they would use American culture, which was their culture, by the way. It's not American at all. Everything in America has been given by the same Bernard-type characters that worked with these institutions and the Frankfurt School. Now, Theo Adorno was one of the biggest players. Very interesting man, an utter contemptuous elitist, because he actually said that very few people would have the intellect to understand his writings in his own book. You know, he took over the culture industry mainly for Britain. He financed a lot of the groups that broke through in the 60s to the top. He also was pretty well a genius in music. That was a sideline of his. Great friend of the Queen, friendly with the London Philharmonic Orchestra. And he did definitely write a lot of the stuff for the top groups in Britain as they came out with the raging 60s and the sexual liberation and all that stuff. Just do it in the road like the Beatles song, all that stuff. And the drugs came in at the same time. So much sacks of drugs were thrown over university walls for free by limos just passing by, you know, get the whole thing kicked off. Every culture has had its head spun around by the culture industry. Now, Theo Adorno says we must degrade each culture, degrade them, until they have no past to look back on. It says we must degrade them and down through all the sexual immorality we can cause. It says including we'll know when we've achieved our goal when we get necrophilia is the norm. So here you have a bunch of people who worked with another group called the Macy Group. Bertrand Russell was part of both of them, and a lot of other big players. Lord Bertrand Russell, who would use a form of socialism to guide this through. And you would understand what they mean by socialism. Socialism to them is the scientific domination of all of society to reshape the world, to remake all that was left imperfect and make it perfect. That's what they say at their meetings. And they're talking about us. We're a natural elite. They claim that they're the natural elite, and intellect, intelligentsia should rule our lives in a proper function. It's just too scattered right now. It's just all dysfunctional. In other words, totally controlled society is what they mean by correcting society. Now, the Macy Group that worked with the Frankfurt School was given, again, they all fled out of Germany again, just before Hitler came in, met in New York, and Russell came over, Adorno and all the rest of them. And their job again was how to completely radically alter all that was held to be dear in the Americans' lives. That was independence, personal independence especially. And how they could wear them down bit by bit and again degrade the culture through all kinds of sexual immorality until standard fare of entertainment would be perversion. We have that. We've lived through that. It's here. And how they would gradually show that the state, through movies and all the rest, that the state was in charge. Now you don't get the lone cowboy riding in town cleaning it up. Now you get the SWAT teams and CSI, and you get the FBI and counterterrorism squads and lots of faceless guys in black outfits like Star Wars. That's how they've changed it until everyone's obedient to the system and afraid of that system. And the Macy Group was given authority to exist in perpetuity and to change the culture of America by President Truman. This is in their own records, if you look them up. This is in their own records. We think, see, the average person, you're born into it. You'll say, well, why would you have and I realized this when I was only 7, because I used to listen to the Moscow radio. And there's a Department of Culture that would come out and announce itself, the Department of Culture. Then I looked into Britain and it said British Department of Culture. Canada, Canadian Department of Culture. I thought, why would your government have a Department of Culture if you, people, collectively are the culture? It was set up to change the culture. And the Department of Culture decides what you're going to see on television and how they're going to grade you through it. The Department of Culture is where you get all your political correctness from. They hire authors by the thousands. I think every author in Canada gets a grant from the Department of Culture. Now, the only way you can get the grant, and I've seen the forms for it here, even music as well, it says you must aim to radically alter the culture in order to qualify for this government grant. Then they give you a list of things either to sing about or if you're a novelist to write about and insert in your writings. Or if you're a cartoonist, in the cartoons. That's why you got cartoons complaining that the older folk destroyed society by consuming too much. They're all getting paid to do that by your governments. Yes, it's so interesting because until you go into the history of the main organization that presidents authorized to create the culture industry, and that was the Frankfurt School that was kicked out of Germany. They flew from Germany when the Nazis came in. And their whole idea in Germany was to break down the entire structure of society, but especially the family unit. And it was a university, basically. And they ran from there into the U.S. for safe harbor and immediately went to work on the U.S. culture. But after World War II, presidents gave them permission to join with the Macy Group and members of the Vienna School, as they called them too, who were all Marxists, all of them, including the Frankfurt School. And your tax money has been funding this ongoing program into disintegration to bring out the new that will come out after it's all gone into mayhem. The new, like the phoenix arises from the ashes. And this is all part of it. Now, part of it too is training generations over time to worship celebrities. And so celebrities are called soft power by the United Nations. And it doesn't matter what they do, if it's a stripper or whatever she happens to be, as long as she's doing her job and she's well known by the public, and the public give their children to them, that's a common thing too, then they're used for political purposes and psychosocial alterations as well. So this is an ongoing agenda, well-funded, incredibly well-funded, and even the Census Bureau of Canada attends the international census meetings every year, and they admitted in 2001 that their job was to test the pulse of the public always to find out if they're ready to accept the next push of the envelope as they go into more and more debasement of the culture. That's what your censor departments are for, to find out if you're ready to be debased even further and ready to accept even more new ideas. Now, tonight I'll also put up a link. It'll go very quickly off the YouTube to a program I've mentioned on using celebrities, and to show you how gullible and stupid the public are, where they'll give their children over to total strangers if they think that those children could be put into the movies or ads for television or whatever. And it's called Star Suckers. It won't be up there for long. I guarantee you it'll be pulled if you don't grab it right away. And it also shows you the scams of using celebrities as well for the big charities, and where the money really goes, billions of dollars go. It's never to the desired target. But as I say, the Frankfurt School is something you've got to study, and you've got to study the Macy Group as well. And the music right up into the present day is ongoing with the Frankfurt type psychology based. And so, of course, is all the messages you get in the music videos of what you should be like and how you're supposed to emulate and copy, because children especially, copy what they see. And they're too young to make their decisions themselves, and they have no idea of the repercussions of what they will do at that age on the future, their own future. They have no idea how it's going to affect them. But this is the target, is the minds of the very young, just like the Soviet system had, and just like the Nazis had. It's the same system. Get them young, and you can make them into anything you want them to be. Yeah.
Right, and I think as well, the parents have had to have been also brainwashed along the way.
Yeah, it's incremental. That's right. It's intergenerational. If you put 4 generations together on the same couch watching TV, I'd blush for the eldest lady there, because if it was your great-grandmother, for instance, because that's how rapidly, really, since the 60s, they've brought down society. Yeah. You've already seen, I watched a sci-fi series someone sent me, and it had everything in it. Homosexuality, lesbianism, everything. But it was gradually introduced over this long-term series. First to get you, so there's only 2 or 3 different systems they use to make a movie or a story. And they're all pretty much the same. And you always see people in trouble who bond with each other, the group, where it's cops or where it's whatever. So there's this bunch on a little spaceship like Star Trek, and different creatures. You could even bring bestiality into it because of some of the creatures. All the messages were in that whole series. Every single one of them was in that whole series. And people don't turn it off because they get hooked initially when they're not too bad and they're not cursing and swearing and using all the language. And once you're caught up on it, you want to know what the next series is what's going to happen. Will they live? Will they survive? They're getting chased by all these strange creatures. And in between it all is the stories of, as I say, bestiality, lesbianism, homosexuality, and you could even bring in pedophilia into one of the scenes as well. So that's how you're trained without knowing it, mainly through fiction and then through school. It's interesting, the guys who started up the Royal Institute of International Affairs, Council on Foreign Relations, because they had a group called the Kindergarten. And these guys were the youngest members of these banking families, by the way, international money lenders. And they took young recruits in, but they called it kindergarten. And they also said that they start up real kindergartens to retrain each generation into the next level of the changes. So you must get them very young, and sure enough, you walk into any kindergarten, it's been like this for years now, there's a big picture of the globe on the wall and how global we all are and all the rest of it, and that's where you start it. That's also where you start having them go through these machines to detect metal on their bodies. That's training them for the life that they will grow up into. You'll notice the younger ones